Hey everyone, I'm Matt with TX Arms. Today we're going to take a look at how to build an AR15 lower receiver. Alright, so when I start off, first thing I'm going to use on the lower is going to be one of these vise blocks. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up in the vise, and our lower receiver is going to fit on there just like that. But I'm going to go ahead and start with the magazine catch, so that we can go ahead and hold on to our receiver. So I'm going to use one of our builder's kits. So we use these bags in order. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this first bag here, and normally this toothpick is also in this bag. But I'm going to start with my magazine catch, which is my button, my spring, and the catch itself. I'm going to insert the catch on this side, and it's going to stick through over here. My spring goes on, and then my button I'm just going to set in, which is going to push my catch out on the other side, and I'm just going to slowly turn that in until it catches. Next, I need to grab a punch out of here, and I'm just going to use an aluminum punch over here, or brass punch, something softer than this side, but I'm just going to push this button all the way through and extend it, so you can see here on the other side. That's just going to help extend that catch even farther. So I'm going to push that button all the way in and hold it, and then just spin this catch all the way through until I can feel it hitting my punch on the other side. So right there, I caught it, I felt it catch. So I'm just going to line it back up, let it go, and then my button is flush with the post over here. So that's how we're going to install our magazine catch. From there, I like to move on to the bolt catch, which is our next piece in here. So we've got our bolt catch, our spring, detent, and a roll pin. This is a spiralized stainless steel roll pin that we use in our upgraded kits. It could also be a traditional split pin, and then this is also where we're going to use our toothpick. So first, I'm going to assemble my detent inside the spring just like this, and then this is going to fit down inside this hole in the lower receiver just like that, and our bolt catch is going to go right on top of it like so. And I use my toothpick as a slave, and you can see how that's going to actuate. From there, I'm going to make sure that my vise is good and tight, because we're going to start pounding on it, and I don't want any of those vibrations or impacts to move it. And anytime I am driving any roll pins or anything like that, I use a little bit of grease. This is just the Aeroshell 64, and I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on here on the end of my roll pin, and then also on the receiver. And this is just going to keep and prevent that from galling up. And I'm going to use the correct size punch. Put my roll pin in the punch, and this is just a starter's punch. This is from Obsidian Arms, and it's designed for doing this job. It holds that roll pin right in place, and I'm just going to tap it in. Try and keep everything lined up and going straight. And you'll see we spit that toothpick out the back side, and that's going to go until it's just flush. And then from there, I'm going to grab my punch with the nipple on it to help guide it, and seat that the rest of the way in. And then we can pull that off and function check and make sure that we're just below flush on both sides. Looks like I can tap it one shot here on this side. I'm just set it just a little bit deeper. There we go. And so now we've got our pin, catch, and detent, and then check it for functionality, make sure it's not binding, and that we have good actuation. So now we've got our bolt catch installed. From there, I'm going to move over to the takedown pin, and I kind of start with some of the harder ones first, just to get them out of the way. But we're going to start with the front pins. So we're going to open up our second bag here, which has got our pivot pin, which has got the flat edge on it. We've also got our takedown pin, and then there's 3 sets of these springs in here, and then 3 sets of detents in our kit, because inevitably those start flying. And then we've also got our buffer tube, or our buffer detent and spring back here. So I'm going to take my takedown pin and one of our springs and detents, and then I like to use this tool here from Real Avid. I'm going to go ahead and set this up. I'm going to drop my spring in, my detent in, push this flush, rotate that up, and this is now capturing that spring and that detent. I also use a little bit of grease here in my takedown pin. I'm just going to put a dab of grease there and there in those channels. This is just going to help it slide nice and give a good feel. Slide that in, and I'm just going to use my takedown pin to push these other pins out of the way. These fall out, and then we've now installed the front takedown pin. Make sure it's actually captured by twisting it, and then just give it a push, and we've got our pivot pin installed. I'm going to go ahead and close that one up, and then from there we're going to start working on the back side with the buffer tube and our takedown pin back here. So I'm going to start staging our buffer tube. We're going to use a steel QD end plate and our castle nut here. So this is going to start off with our castle nut threaded all the way on as far as we can go. And then my end plate is going to go to the inside, facing up. And that's just going to slide straight down like that. Now when we're installing this, we are going to use some more of this Aeroshell 64 on these threads. You do want to use some type of lubricant on these threads. So we're just going to put a good amount of Aeroshell 64, and we're just going to thread this into the receiver. And what I'm looking at is the inside here at our spot where our buffer retainer is going to go. I'm going to thread that until we're almost touching it, so right about there. And then I'm going to take my spring and buffer retaining pin, drop those down into their slot where they belong, right there. I'm going to hold that down with my finger and give that one more turn, so that's going to line up, and that's what's going to retain our buffer retaining pin back there. Now from there I'm going to turn it just past, tighten this up a little bit, and now we can put in our takedown. Let's go ahead and put a little bit of grease in this channel as well. I'm just going to slide that right into place, followed then by our detent first, and then our other detent spring. And that detent spring is what's going to retain our takedown pin, and I'm just going to rotate to make sure that that gets captured. And all I'm going to do at this point is rotate until that spring gets kicked off to the side, pull that end plate all the way back, and then just kind of push that spring until it's set and straight, and then gently close that up until it's nice and flush. And then let's go ahead and put a little bit more grease on these threads. And then we'll screw our castle nut all the way down. So now we've got our buffer tube or receiver extension, castle nut, end plate, takedown pin, buffer retaining pin, and spring all installed. From here, I'm going to go ahead and exchange these vices out to our receiver extension jig, which is going to fit down in there. And this is going to ensure that we've got proper torque and that everything is lined up, because now we're clamping onto the receiver extension as well as the trigger guard to ensure that we have perfect alignment. I'm going to tighten this down. And torque this jig down. The torque spec on this receiver extension is 38 to 42 foot-pounds. It's difficult to do that if we don't have a torque wrench. So I'm going to turn that on, get that calibrated, and I'm just going to set it right in the middle to 40 foot-pounds. So we've got good engagement without damaging any of the threads. There you go. I like the way that one feels a little bit better. And I'm just going to turn this. We can pull that one off at 40 foot-pounds. And now we have our receiver extension torqued onto our lower receiver. And then from there, we can go ahead and stake it. To stake it, let's see if this is going to fit down in here. Let's see, I need this one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of put this rod in there a little bit, and that's going to help protect and align all of these. We're actually using a Forward Controls design castle nut, so we can get a few different staking points on it. I'm going to get my staking wrench, or staking punch rather, center it up, and let's see. Looks good. And all we're doing is just moving a little bit of that metal from our end plate into the castle nut. And that's just going to help prevent that castle nut from coming off. And one more spot over here. Kind of center it up, and then about 2/3 of the way in. It's a good spot. And we're just going to move some of that metal into the castle nut. So you don't have to use this reaction rod type thing inside of the receiver. I just do that to help support the inside of that tube a little bit, and that's going to prevent any accidental crushing. But then you can now see our staking has moved a little bit of that material into the castle nut. So now we have a properly installed receiver extension. Oops. go ahead and pull this tool back off the vise and go back to our vise block. So let's see, from here we can install our safety, grip, trigger components. I'm going to go ahead and install our fire control group. So these are the components we have for our fire control group. Normally I kind of pre-install some of these triggers on the ones that we sell, but I went ahead and took it apart so you can see exactly how all of these springs are going to go together. So let's start with the hammer. It's going to go exactly like this. This is the face that's going to be striking the back of the firing pin, and then our hammer spring is going to be oriented on it exactly like this. So if it's backwards like this, we're going to be unwinding that spring, and we're not going to get the correct tension on that spring, and potentially lose energy to not be able to hit that and ignite the primer. So it's going to go on just like this. And the way I remember it are the legs are going to be on the front of the hammer. So I kind of lay it out just like this, and then I'm just going to take and install the spring on the hammer, and I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees so it's going to sit just like this. And we can always check, because I should be able to lay it down on a bench and have that springiness telling me that we're using the energy of that spring to strike the hammer. So that's how we're going to install our hammer spring. On our trigger, we have our disconnect spring. This has got a flared end and a skinny end. We're just going to take that flared end, and you'll see a channel right here on the trigger. That flared end is going to go down in that channel and push that all the way down and make sure it's flush. Use a small punch if I need to, just to make sure that spring is sitting flush all the way down in there. And then our disconnector is going to sit on top of it just like that. We've also got our trigger spring, which is going to sit just like this. So I'm going to take and drop these loops over the side of my legs, and you'll be able to see right here on the spring that the front of that shelf, or the front of the spring, is sitting underneath the shelf but not on top of the trigger, and those legs are coming down at about a 45 degree. This is what's going to be resetting our trigger. And then I set our disconnect. It's going to sit just on top of that. And then we've got our hammer and trigger springs. Each one of these hammer and trigger springs have these notches in them, one in the center and one on the side. So when we're looking at what's keeping our hammer and trigger springs in the receiver and keeping them from walking out, on the hammer, if you'll look down through the hole, you can almost see just a little bit of a piece of metal sticking on the inside. That's actually a J spring that rides all the way through, and that J spring is going to grab and hold on to that middle latch right there. So that's what's going to hold our hammer spring in. And then as our hammer is sitting on the trigger, each one, or one of these hammer legs, depending on how many notches you have, is going to ride on this outside, and that's going to prevent our trigger pin from walking out. So we can come over here back to the lower receiver. I'm going to go ahead and take my trigger assembly, and I'm just going to drop it down inside the primer pocket just like that. And then I've got my punch from Obsidian Arms that's going to help me start it. I'm just going to line it all up, push that all through, and you'll see how that's already lined up. Take my trigger pin now. I'm just going to slide this all the way through, and now our trigger is installed. Next, I'm going to grab my hammer, and this can get a little bit tricky because we saw earlier where our hammer spring is going to ride on this leg and hold this into place, which means down here on the trigger pin anyways, these legs of this hammer need to be on the back side of this trigger pin. It's also important to note that if you have your safety installed already, we do have to have the safety in the fire position. It will not install if it's on safe, but we don't have that in there yet, so I don't have to worry about that. But I'm going to put those legs behind the trigger pin, and then I'm going to press the hammer all the way forward, line up the hammer hole, and then go ahead and insert my slave pin just like that. And then I'm going to take my hammer pin, see if we can get this lined up. Push it all the way in. And sometimes you'll get it to right about there. Now what has happened, as we can see on this other side, this hammer is kind of cockeyed a little bit. So I'm just going to grab that hammer, twist it down into place, and push it all the way through. So now we have our hammer and our trigger installed on the AR15. And I do want to go down inside and double check and make sure that our hammer legs are on the outside of the trigger and that they are actually holding the inside of those springs. Put a little bit of light down in there so you can see the hammer pin, or the trigger pin rather, is actually being held by the hammer pin. And that's how we're going to install our fire control group into the AR15. And we're done with this punch. Next we can move on to our safety, which is our third and final bag. Go ahead and open this up. We have our safety selector spring, which is also the same as your ejector spring in the bolt, and then our safety selector detent. This is a slightly different shape with this detent as compared to the takedown detent, so they're fairly different, and should be able to recognize the difference between those. But our safety does need to go in now, and to do that we have to cock the hammer. Same reason we couldn't install the hammer without this being on fire, we can't install the safety without this being cocked. So I'm going to go ahead and insert our safety. I should also note that we have a channel here on the side that's going to line up with the right side of the receiver with our detent channel, so it's going to go in from left to right. And then I'm going to take and just turn the receiver over here, and you'll be able to see the hole right here now on the left side where our safety is going to drop into. I do like to use just a little bit of grease on here on the safety. This is again kind of gives a really good feel, protects everything, prevents all the galling, stuff like that. But I'm just going to go ahead and drop that detent all the way down, push it down, and you can see now that detent is what's going to work on the safety there and prevent that from falling out. Next we're going to put our grip on, and this is another little pro tip. If I use a little bit of grease right here on the hole on the grip where our spring goes, and drop my spring in place, now when I'm putting this on I don't have to worry about that spring falling out. So let's go ahead and install this hammer. I'm just going to get a long set of pliers here and see if we can line up and drop this screw down through the hole with our star washer. And then this is just going to slide over the top, and then you want to make sure over here on this side, make sure that we're not bending the spring and that we're actually getting good engagement as it's going down into that channel. So we got everything lined up, and then I'm just going to get my screwdriver. Sometimes these are a hex head, sometimes they're a flat head, sometimes it's a Phillips head. This one just happens to be a Phillips head screw. I'm just going to tighten this one all the way down. Make sure do not cross thread these. We have that star washer in there, and we're just going to tighten it good and tight. But do remember, we do have a steel screw going down into inside an aluminum receiver, so we want to make sure that we are not damaging it. And then we can check our safety. Fire control group works. Back on a safe, back on a fire, back on a safe. So now we have our safety and grip installed. Last, I'm going to put on a trigger guard. This is actually the Magpul Enhanced Trigger Guard, which installs differently than the traditional trigger guard. I've got a different tool for that one. This one just installs with these 1/16 hex screws. So I'm just going to pull these all out. And the trigger guard is going to drop in to place. Let's see, it helps if I put it on correctly here. trying to watch the video while we're doing this. And it's kind of a tight fit. It's got a couple of little knobs on there that are just giving it a really good friction fit. But now I need to line everything up. And make sure that it's all in place. Right about there looks good. I'm going to take this tiny little screw, feed it into there. It does help if you have these screws kind of pre-started beforehand so they get their catch on this polymer going in. And it's also good to note that when putting these in, I like to go forward about half a turn and backwards a quarter turn, because these screws are cutting into that polymer and kind of self-tapping themselves in. And by doing that, like forward and backwards motion, you're going to prevent over-torquing and stripping one of these screws off inside the handguard, or the trigger guard rather, and you're going to have a bad day. So I do like to start them beforehand just to get a couple of threads going, and then just that constant forward pressure. And that one's not catching yet, so let's see if we can line that one up a little bit better. There it goes. Now we caught it. Same thing. It's definitely catching now. You'll definitely feel a difference. Continuous downward pressure around and back off to relieve some of that pressure as we're cutting those threads into the polymer. Just to make sure we don't strip the very tiny hex head as it goes in. And one more on the other side. Yep, now it's catching. These are great little trigger guards. They can just be a little challenging sometimes to get lined up, and especially when using these very tiny set screws like this. And definitely use a good strong punch. Don't use a piece of garbage, because that will round those out super fast. And then last thing we need to do to finish our install is our action spring and our buffer. And this is one little tip that I like to do this, completely optional, but I'm going to put a little bit of grease on this spring as we slide it into the extension, and it's really going to help quiet down the action as well as smooth it out. So I'm just going to put on a glove, and this is just a basic wheel bearing grease, not a whole lot. Granted, this looks like a lot, but we're going to just lube this entire spring up. And then just put this all over the entire spring. Set this down. And there is just a touch more than I want to use, so I'm just going to wipe off one of this heavier section here. There's just a small amount of grease. I'm going to put our buffer in, run this down into the receiver extension, and then down, and that is how we install and assemble a full AR15 lower. Clean up the rest of the grease, and off we go. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.